Okay, our week 6 topic is, as stated here, gender and sexuality, but of course, we'll bring in some aging as well in our discussion. We are going to approach sexuality through kind of three large frameworks. First, we're going to look at defining sexuality and some of the challenges with this. Then we're going to look at all the different ways that culture shapes sexuality. And finally, we'll introduce a topic that we will revisit later on in the term, which is inequality. And so we'll look at how sexuality and power intersect. So one of the issues we have with defining sexuality is that it is not a simple concept, right? That it is multi-component and has several different aspects that inform it. Initially, when anthropologists started looking at sexuality, they didn't focus so much on defining it, but rather on these kind of broad questions, right? Looking at how sexuality is a social product, how it's an economic product, how sexuality varies across time and within and across culture. So this gets more down to the understanding and defining sexuality thing. But then a more recent topic that's emerged relates to how do we understand sexual agency. And this again relates to shifts as well in our own culture around acknowledging the tension and the dynamic that exists between sexuality, gender, and inequality or inequity. So as I state here, based on what we've learned so far, if we were to define sexuality, we would automatically think of it as having at least these four major pieces as part of it, right? Our biological sex, our gender identity, our gender expression, and our sexual orientation, or what we might call our sexual identity. And I think defining sexuality purely on the basis of just these four traits works, but I think from an anthropological perspective, it helps to look at a definition like that provided to us by someone like Guest. And so Guest provides this definition in a big paragraph form, but I've broken it up into the three major pieces of it. So the first piece relates to an understanding that sexuality is part of a complex range of desires, beliefs, and behaviors that are related to erotic physical contact, intimacy, and pleasure. Okay, so many of us would agree that, yeah, this is a key component of sexuality. But what I like about Guest's definition is that he then goes on to talk about how sexuality is also the cultural arena within which we debate ideas about the kinds of desires and behaviors are morally right, appropriate, and natural. And so what he's including here is that cultural component, right? That our idea of what our desires, and behaviors are appropriate, what is pleasurable, what forms of contact are acceptable or are not acceptable between individuals are all shaped by our culture. And so that's what the second point here is getting at. And then finally, his third point then is what I'll talk about later on in this presentation, relates to how all of these ideas then are used to create unequal access to status, power, privilege, and resources. Okay. So what this means is that from an anthropological perspective, sexuality, particularly our sexual feelings and practices, are part of our nature. We acknowledge that there is a biological component. And later on in this presentation, I talk about some of the neurochemistry of love and attraction. But they're also shaped by our culture. And so again, these are the kinds of ideas or practices that are shaped by our culture, right? What are considered to be normal or proper or appropriate versus those which are not seen as such. And often those practices that are taboo or deviant or deemed inappropriate are often regulated, right? So there's legislation that says, no, you cannot do this, right? So we codify it into law if we agree as a society that, yes, this behavior is so inappropriate, we'll actually formalize laws around it and not just leave it to the realm of ethics. Of course, who our appropriate sexual partners are, and we'll talk about incest taboo shortly. And we also have to think about the whens and wheres of sexual relations and when they are appropriate. So this means that sexuality as well is also learned and malleable to some extent. Now, when we use ethnology, cross-cultural comparison, one of the things we find is that sexuality and how it's constructed and how it's understood. Again, all these ideas of permissiveness and restrictiveness vary with very few exceptions. And one of these exceptions is incest prohibitions or incest taboos. And simply, all incest taboos do is define the parameters under which we can reproduce, right? So they're regulating sexual behavior and saying these are the individuals who are permitted or allowed to produce offspring, right? Now, the form that the incest taboo takes and what exactly those parameters are vary cross-culturally, okay? So again, the idea of an incest taboo, all cultures have incest taboos, but what those taboos look like is culturally specific, okay? One of the ways that we can examine this idea about variations in the rules around sexuality, around practices and partners, is to look at things like consent and affection. So I have some information in a subsequent slide that also talks about some work that was done by a linguistic anthropologist around college policies and a shift away from a no means no to a yes means yes consent policy on campus. I've posted a link here to a very popular video that I'd recommend you watch that kind of outlines how at McEwen we conceptualize consent and how we teach consent. But we can also look at affection. And I came across this article a couple of years ago that talks about cross-cultural variation in showing and demonstrating an affection. And this is something that we may not think about, that the act of touching someone, hugging them, kissing them, and I mean, we're talking about pre-COVID times, of course, vary in terms of what is and is not appropriate, right? It all depends on our relationship to the individual, our sex, our gender, our age, our relative status, right? So all of these different factors shape what is and is not appropriate. And so this article, and I summarize below, has some really interesting insights into different cultural practices around showing affection, right? Another thing we have to look at, and we'll talk about this more in the next topic, is the accepted relationship between sex and marriage, and also the conceptualization of sex and the shift in this conceptualization of sex for reproduction towards sex as pleasure. So again, we have to think about all these issues around permissiveness and restrictiveness. And again, next topic, we'll talk about the consequences and why sex and marriage is so regulated by cultures. It's also important to note here, as I state here, that human sexuality is the outlier in primates and mammals. So again, if we take this biological perspective, we can look at the work of Jared Diamond, where he talks about how humans, and he outlines the kind of traits that separate human sexual activity from other animals. Helen Fisher, this is the work I mentioned earlier, talks about the neurochemistry of romantic love and affection, and how we do have this kind of predisposition towards forming bonds with other people, but then how culture shapes how we deem these kinds of bonds and the kinds of bonds we shape with other people as appropriate or not. Katz here, or Cates, talks about heterosexuality, and again, this idea of sex for pleasure versus sex for reproduction as being quote unquote fairly recent, and this just relates to the appearance of the term heterosexuality. So it's not that heterosexuality did not exist prior to 1892, but rather it was not part of kind of the broader public and scientific discourse. And so I talk about some of his work down below and summarize it here. Again, this idea that what we call heterosexuality today really does reflect our understanding of the relationships and interactions that exist between members of the different sexes. Also understanding the reproductive role that sexual intercourse plays for our species, but also that we have these cultural ideas about the practice and purpose of sex. And then he also talks a little bit about how this construction of sex being linked with marriage, in particular heterosexual marriage and reproduction and the production of kin and offspring, is something that has been reinforced by how here in the West, and actually in other parts of the world as well, weddings are conceptualized. And again, we'll return to this next week. So when it comes then to what I'll broadly call non-heterosexual sexualities, or ones like I've listed here: homosexuality, asexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, transsexuality, etc., that our assumptions around whether or not these are natural or innate to humans or deviant or inappropriate are all a reflection of our cultural learning. And I think it's really important to note that anti-homosexual attitudes, for example, are not a cross-cultural universal, right? That other cultures recognize and acknowledge and accept other forms of sexuality much in the same way that other genders or outside of male and female, out of the heteronormative construction of gender and sex, are also accepted as well. And of course, our gender roles do have a significant impact on our sexuality. So in the notes, I outline the work of Roger Lancaster, who talks about machismo and sexuality in Nicaragua, that it's not simply the act itself is deemed to be heterosexual or homosexual based on your role in that act. So if you're a recipient versus a giver. Okay. And then also some acts may not be viewed as sexual in nature as well. And this kind of goes back to the previous point regarding affection, that hugging and kissing between family members, for example, may not be seen as sexual until it is, right? So our society constructs all these different ideas. So one of the readings for this week is the work of Hurt looking at male initiation in Papua New Guinea. And I specifically selected this because it introduces a whole bunch of terminology that will come up next week when we look at marriages, but also then is meant to get you to think about a little bit about some of the biases and assumptions you bring to understanding sexuality and what acts are perceived as sexual or not, right? So he talks about how, as part of the rite of passage, that males, in order to be full adults within their society, for the group that Hurt studied in Papua New Guinea, need or require to be orally inseminated with semen in order for their semen organ to be activated, right? So while in our culture we may conceptualize this as a form of not just a homosexual act, but in many cases a form of pedophilia, for this particular group, they do not conceptualize it as either one, right? That this is a necessary part of a rite of passage. It is not a sexual act, but rather an important cultural practice, right? So this is showing the importance of cultural relativism in understanding rituals in other societies. Now, part of the reason why we, as outsiders, may experience tension when studying topics like this and be saying, well, no, this is a form of pedophilia, that these are children who are involved in this process, is that in our society, we have a lot of concepts around individualism, freedom, choice, or what we might call agency in terms of how we recognize consent and sexuality. And so, again, here's that study by Deborah Cameron, the linguistic anthropologist, looking at consent policies on campus. I've also included the example of PERDA here to look at how really what this boils down then to is the idea of how sexuality and power intersect. And I think Abu Lughud's readings, which is one of my favorites in our course book, our textbook for this course, looks at this idea, right? Challenges a whole bunch of notions around not only like what forms of sexuality are and are not appropriate, how sexuality is linked with the practice of marriage and with incest taboos, but also that we need to be cautious about constructing ideas of sexuality as being universally understood and practiced within a culture, right? That everyone has the same ideas of the acceptable or appropriate ways of behaving. And so Abu Lughud's consideration of differences in deflowering practice really clearly illustrates this, right? That even within Egyptian Bedouin communities, there is variation in terms of, again, what is permissive and what is restrictive, and shows that these ideas have changed over time. So if we're going to be talking about power and inequity, then I should provide you with some definitions. And so that's what the following slides do. Please do remember, however, that we will return to this as a topic and looking at inequality and inequity in a lot more detail. But I think it's important at this point to kind of keep these ideas around the different forms that power takes in our mind because of just how heavily it shapes and intersects with sexuality. So again, this can play out then in terms of the roles that are played and the division of labor within heterosexuality. Again, we're going to look at this further on in the course as well. Inequity can play out in terms of access to marriage itself, and clearly this is an arena where we've seen a lot of debate around sexuality, right? So the denial of legal status by different states, or even variations within states. So the United States, for example, that in theory and in practice has marriage equality, has other legislation that is state specific that kind of contravenes that federal legislation. But there can also, even if there is a legal parameter that's permitting marriage equity, there still may be then, of course, other communities and other social norms that restrict these behaviors as well. So then we have to think about, well, what are these cultural institutions that regulate sexuality? So we've already talked about marriage, but divorce is also another one of these things. We'll talk next week about monogamy and polygamy and how they vary. In here, we've talked about age of consent and definition of incest. I've just alluded to and mentioned the right of, and I need to update this acronym, but of LGBTQIA2S plus individuals, or what we might broadly refer to as individuals within the queer community, although acknowledge that's not a label that all members want. Which is why I've included the acronym here. I've mentioned the intersection with economics as well. So when we think about things like pornography, sex trafficking, and prostitution, which are all various forms of sex work, that we have a lot of rules and regulations around these forms of sex work. And a lot of our concerns come from when basically there's a lot of inequity in the power dynamic, right? So sex trafficking, for example, where we have the trafficking of humans, there, of course, we're concerned about that because of the lack of rights and agency for the individuals who are being trafficked, right? That we've agreed that as humankind, that this is a problematic practice and needs to be addressed. But then it's interesting then that we see other forms of sex work as very different. And I mentioned this in our live lecture, that I'm very curious to see how our conceptions of sex work change in a post-COVID world. And I mean this to refer specifically to the rise of sites like OnlyFans, and also people seeking out alternative revenue streams and sources of income with kind of the change in our economy resulting from COVID. And of course, reproductive rights are another important aspect in which we see power and sexuality intersect, in which we see formal regulation of sexuality as well, right? So all of these regulations, all of these questions then, to me, expose the intersections of sexuality and power, and therefore lead us then into the approach that I take in this course, and that I think is fundamental to understanding these topics, which is intersectionality, right? And so this is derived largely from my readings in intersectional feminism. So it's, as Guest defines, this is an understanding of the way systems of power interconnect to affect individual lives and group experiences. Within a feminist framework, intersectionality is used to understand how this then promotes gender inequity and gender inequality, which of course I'm going to argue are really problematic things, and we need to change that. And so I've linked to an article here that talks about, again, looking at some of these dynamics of intersection, that what does it mean for people who are queer, but also people of color, and how their queerness and their queer identity and their identity as a person of color intersect in ways that make their lived experiences very different from people who are white and queer, right? And I love this diagram, and what this shows is kind of what we might call a wheel of intersectionality, and shows how privilege and oppression play out in different ways based on, again, the intersection of gender, ability, sexuality, sex, language as well. We don't often think of this, but this is present. Religion, all of these different factors come into play when we're looking at the lived experiences of individuals. Okay. And then I also wanted to wrap up then by reminding you of readings that we've done in a previous topic. So remember that our issues around things like reproductive rights are controversial, not just because of issues around sexuality, because of the politics of reproduction, but also how new assistive reproduction technologies have also shaped our understanding and challenged for a long time, which what we thought was an explicit natural connection between pregnancy and birth with women. And so Rigoni's article on surrogacy, I think, really addresses this topic well. And when we return to the construction of motherhood and fatherhood, we'll see how this plays out in different ways. Okay, so that's our topic for this week. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you on the flip side.